It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My family has roots here, and my mother went to university here back in the 40s, but to do German, not anything as practical as engineering in that sense. So it's good to be here. I should say, by way of my own background, my first degree is physics and philosophy, which gives me a philosopher's delight of concepts and a physicist's contempt for social science, and you'll see that come through as I start to go on and talk about some of the work we're doing on new research paradigms. And I'm going to throw some new language in. I'm going to talk later about abductive reasoning and abductive research, and I'll explain that when I come to it. That's going to be key to the work we're doing. Subsequent to that, I worked on the program to combat racism for a few years, which took me to Australian Aboriginal land rights, to Latin America, and a whole bunch of things. I'm now firmly of the belief that everybody should actually spend at least a year overseas in some difficult environment before they're 25, because that shook me up. When you see an activist shot in front of you in Darwin and the police won't do anything about it because he's only an Abo, you start to realise the world isn't the comfortable place you grew up in. So that sort of background. Eventually I had to earn a living, moved into decision support systems in the early days of computers, and from there into business management, general management, and then into strategy and research. And for the last 15 years, I've effectively been in research in IBM, and for the last 7 years for myself. About 10 years ago, the group I ran decided that we wanted to start again from scratch on social science. We decided it was in a really bad place, torn between an acceptance or a rejection of a model of science, which itself was about 40 or 50 years out of date. Whether you call it critical realism against social constructivism or postmodernism against modernism, it was all based on trying to create this contrast between empirical proof and something which was other, sort of classic dichotomy. So what we did is we went back to natural science, particularly complex adaptive systems, cognitive science. I'm going to talk about both of those in the course of this lecture, but then also into some of the more sensible areas of social systems, anthropology, ethnography. Probably created the first ever distributed ethnographic system, and we'll talk about that later. So the idea was that every now and then you need to do a reset, which is why I've put that quote up there. For those of you who don't know, Cardinal Bellarmine was one of the most intelligent theologians of his day. This is at the time of the Reformation. He was one of the leading thinkers on the Counter-Reformation, and also the guy who had to deal with Galileo. And this is a famous letter he writes about Galileo to another supporter, Toscanini, which basically says, look, it's okay to say that the Earth goes around the sun for the purpose of mathematical calculation in universities, but it's obviously ridiculous to say it does it in practice. Now we look at this with the benefit of a few hundred years of hindsight, and we say how stupid. The reality is there are Cardinal Bellarmines in every university, government, and industry that we work in. What actually happens, this is a key part of what we know from cognitive science, basically entrained patterns of belief for ways of doing things persist long after their utility has been disproved. And you've only got to look at the history of science. Major scientific advance is always mavericks or accidents. It's very rarely progression from the existing field. So what I'm going to be talking about now is actually a paradigm shift. I want to start and explain that. I'm going to do some of the core science on this, create a model to show how management thinking has moved over the last 100 years, and then finish off with some of the new intervention and techniques. I should say now I'm going to make some strong distinctions between things. A huge amount of people confuse systems dynamics with complex adaptive systems theory, and it's not the same thing. So I'm going to exaggerate differences to make sure people don't make that confusion. So I reserve the right to be more reasonable under questioning, but more extreme in presentation. Right? That's the way it's going to work. So, hold that quote in mind. First of all, let's get the complexity out of the way first, and I'm going to talk, some of you will know a lot about this, I'm told some people won't, so I'm going to do the basic introduction. What I want to do, and I'll define my terms first, I want to define a system as any network which has coherence. Now, the word coherence is going to be of increasing importance over the next few decades. It's come out of philosophy as an alternative to empirical proof or relativism. Ironically driven by the need to handle creationism in the USA. I still don't believe we have to take this nonsense seriously, but we do, right? So you can say that evolutionary theory is coherent to the facts, but creationism is incoherent to the facts. It doesn't require you to say that evolution is completely right, because it isn't. If you look at the recent discoveries on exaptation, for example, which engineers really need to pay attention to, that actually contradicts some of what Darwin said. But we know it's going in the right direction. Yeah? So the concept of coherence is also coming into government policy. You live in a highly uncertain world. How do you discover which interventions are coherent, even though you may not be able to fully predict what result they will bring? Yeah, so here, and there's a whole mathematics of coherence. You can look at Thagard's work on this and the work we've done subsequently. I'll talk later about the work we're doing to produce coherence tests for policy, working on huge narrative databases. Yeah, so the concept of coherence, another word is coalescence rather than categories. Human beings love to put things into little boxes. Anybody done a Myers-Briggs psychological test at any stage? Okay, I've refused my entire life, in many corporates. I've said until somebody can show me some validation for it in natural science, I'm going to refuse it. For those of you who don't know, it was started by two researchers who read a book about Jung, not even a book by Jung, and produced a questionnaire, and it's since become a self-validating system. If you look at the controlled test, it works the same way that the gypsy works with a crystal ball in the fair. It suggests enough with a sufficient level of ambiguity that you fill in the gaps for yourself and then put yourself into a convenient little box. And of course, HR people love these types of systems because they want to treat people like widgets in a machine. Right? We're now starting to move away from categories because categories are dangerous. You don't see things on the borders, into thinking about effectively coalescence or coherence. So coalescence means I know I'm in the center of a gas cloud, but the boundaries become vague or fuzzy. Yeah, so you start to move away from rigid boundaries into these sort of different types of concepts. Yeah. So that's how I'm defining the system, what I'm going to talk about today. An agent is anything which acts within the system. I did at one point talk about actors, but that got me confused with actor network theory, which I don't want to be, so I've gone back to agent. It's important to realize that an agent in a social system can actually be an idea, not necessarily a person. In fact, ideas can be more important than people with agency in complex systems. Human beings are fundamentally dependent on metaphor. Our language evolved from metaphor. Some of the work I'm doing at the moment in battlefield conditions is to produce metaphor-based command languages. Because metaphors allow you to explain very complex ideas in very simple, highly structured ways, in ways we haven't really thought of before. But the point is, the metaphor can become a dominant idea. People get sucked into them, they follow them, they want to carry on in that way. So an agent isn't just a person, it can be a group, or it can be an idea or a concept, and those differ in different areas. Just to shake you up a little bit, for those of you who don't know, culture can change the chemical structure of DNA within 2 generations. So we're now starting to understand an awful lot more about the way physical reality is changed by social systems. So there's an awful lot starting to come out at the moment. So that allows me to define 3 types of system. An ordered system is one where the level of constraint that the system imposes on agents is such that all agent behavior is predictable. And this is what people like to do when they misuse the engineering word in the context of organizations. Personally, I think the engineering community should sue Hammer and Chamfrey from talking about business process re-engineering. Because actually an organization is not a machine. It can't be engineered in the sort of sense they meant it. Anybody come across Six Sigma yet? Yeah, I call it Six Stigma. Business process re-engineering with the worst aspects of Bible Belt fundamentalism added onto it for good measure. The high priests of the cult have different coloured belts to indicate their status as cult leaders. And if they get a black belt, they're exempt from ordinary duties, so they can impose discipline on ordinary members of the firm. 3M throughout Six Sigma because it was destroying their capacity to innovate. Something the consultants are not telling the NHS or government, because of course government always adopt things after industry as on the ground it's industrial best practice. If you didn't know it, it's taught in consultancy. When you can't sell it to industry anymore because they know it doesn't work, go and sell it to government as industrial best practice and you'll get another decade of life. The reality is that engineering approaches, in the management sense of the word, only apply to ordered systems. Only when you have a level of constraint which makes the system controllable and predictable can you actually apply techniques like business process re-engineering or Six Sigma. Right? Nothing wrong or right with this, but that type of system works. The second type of system we have is a chaotic system, and there's all sorts of different ways in which people use chaos. A lot of people, to my mind, confuse chaos theory and complexity theory, but I have to define my terms. I'm talking about chaos in terms of randomness. So a chaotic system is one in which the agents are completely unconstrained. Now, the irony is in a chaotic system, the agents are deterministic, but the system is non-deterministic. Right? But fundamentally, you've got totally random behavior. And again, we don't find that difficult because that's where probability and statistics come into their own, so we can start to manage that if we've got sufficiently large volumes of data. So we've been comfortable with those for some time. But it's only after the last 100 years or so we've become aware of complex adaptive systems. I think really we should trace this back to Pridogine chemistry. Peter Allen, who's a colleague of mine, was one of his PhD students. This is still comparatively recent. Kaufman in biology, Arthur in economics, and a whole group of us in social systems. Complex adaptive systems are one where the nature of the system means that it lightly constrains the agents, but not fully constrains them, and the agents modify the system as they interact with it. The technical phrase for this is your second new word, possibly, is the system and the agents co-evolve. Co-evolution is a key concept in biology. As things interact with other things, patterns form from the interaction. And a key concept which goes with that is you have irreversibility. You can't reverse evolution, whereas you can re-engineer a machine. And that is actually why, and I'll talk about this later, weak signal detection is so critical in social systems. The earlier you detect something, the lower the energy cost of amplification or dampening. By the time it becomes visible on conventional scanning systems, the energy cost of disruption is far too high. A lot of my work, incidentally, was funded both before and after 9/11 by the US and Singapore governments on counterterrorism, and their weak signal detection is absolutely key. And of course, everybody with the benefit of hindsight can tell you that people learning to fly but not take off and land is significant, but hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. Everybody forgets the sheer amount of data being reported in advance, and actually with the benefit of hindsight you can connect up the dots because now you can see the linkages, but you can't connect up the dots in advance. And one of the issues there is how do you make people or bring things to the attention of humans. And again, I'll talk later about generating human sensor networks, because if you can literally get thousands of people involved in partial decision making, you hugely increase the scanning range and you reduce the danger of pattern entrainment, the Cardinal Bellarmine type moments I referred to earlier. So a complex adaptive system is a co-evolution of agents and systems. It's inherently unpredictable. Now, there are two schools of thought on this, and we're going to have a fight in the US government sponsorship in Brisbane next week. Don't ask me why the US government are organising a conference in Brisbane, but they are at this time of the year, but never mind. Right? And the group, those of us who are right say that the systems are non-causal. Those who are wrong say that they are causal, but it's not meaningful, we can never discover what it is. Right? So actually, it doesn't make too much difference in practice, which one you want to go with, but it will be a fun two-day debate with a group of 50 philosophers who may or may not come back alive. But fundamentally, hold that in your mind. If a system cannot be predicted, how do you manage it? Because everything that we've always done has been based for the last 30 or 40 years on the assumption that if you can't predict the future, it's a failure of analysis or data capture. It's the core behind setting targets a year out. The assumption is you should be able to say in advance what you should be able to achieve. The reality is if you're dealing with a complex adaptive system, you can't. And one of the fundamental switches on this, again, I sort of highlighted things I'm going to come to when I come to solutions, is a shift from outcome-based measurement to impact-based measurement. So instead of measuring process-based outcomes, you start to measure impact, which allows you to measure things which are successful, which weren't predicted before they were known. And we're doing that work in the development community in Africa for Gates Foundation and elsewhere at the moment. So there's some big changes coming on this. Now, there's an easier way of understanding this. Sorry, the philosopher in me will come out from time to time. Those three systems are effectively different types of ontology. And I'm using ontology here in the philosophical sense of the word, not the IT corruption of it, to mean taxonomy. And ontology is the nature of the world, the nature of systems. And ontology precedes epistemology. The nature of the world, the nature of the system determines the nature of the ways we know things and we act things. So the fundamental argument here is if it's an ordered system, you know it and you act in it in a very different way than if it's a complex system. And this is a principle effectively called about diverse response. It's one of my big disagreements with John Seddon, who you've had here before, who basically goes from one extreme to the other and denies the validity of ordered systems approaches. Yeah, a true complex adaptive systems view, in fact I would argue a true systems view of the world, says there is a space for highly structured targeted approaches and there's other spaces where it doesn't work. Yeah, effectively methodological diversity, but we need to understand the boundaries. So one way to explain this is think, if you can, about how you would manage a children's party. Everybody can manage organising a party for a bunch of 8 or 9-year-olds? Right, so basically, depending on what type of system it's in, we'd manage it in a different way. So if it's a chaotic system, then the children's behaviour will be completely at random. They'll probably discover the drugs and alcohol and go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Your house will probably burn down in the process, but all property is theft and it was socially constructed in the first place, so why are you worried? And yes, there is a stiletto in that one. I have friends in California who've tried this, but only once. You know, the recovery cost is high, but it's a valid approach. The ordered systems approach, on the other hand, you'll be more familiar with, particularly those of you with administrative responsibilities within the university. Under this, it's of critical importance to agree learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should be aligned with the mission statement for education and society to which you belong, and should be clearly articulated and printed off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropping into ponds, and placed around the room where you're going to hold the party. You then produce a project plan for the party. The project plan should have clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. And the senior adult should start the party with a motivational videotape, because you don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. They then use PowerPoint to show their personal commitment to the party and to demonstrate to the children how their pocket money is linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Following a highly successful completion of the party, you conduct an after-action review, update your best practice database on party management, and mandate future process improvements. If at the end of this, for any reason, the ungrateful brats aren't happy, you hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner who will get them to tell happy clappy stories so they have happy mental models, and suitably indoctrinated, they'll like whatever you put in front of them next time. Everybody reasonably familiar with this approach to party management? The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is very different. We start off by drawing a line in the sand called the boundary and say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. And one of the things you learn fast as an adult is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries, because rigid boundaries become brittle and break catastrophically. We then throw in catalytic probes. I'm now deliberately using the language of complexity. A football, a videotape, a barbecue, a computer game, to see if a pattern of play, known as an attractor, will form as a result of the catalyst. Yeah? If it's a beneficial attractor, we give it more resource. If it's a non-beneficial attractor, we pull resource away from it. So what we actually do, and this is kind of like probably the key phrase of the whole lecture, we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And in that phrase, you have the great hope of complexity theory for government and industry alike, because you manage what can be managed. You don't try and force a complex system to pretend it's ordered simply because that's the strategy system you adopted. Because the trouble is, if you do that, the tension will build up into the system until eventually it breaks into chaos. We did some work while I was at IBM. We actually looked at the density of informal networks against the perceived level of bureaucracy by firm. And there is a direct correlation between the two. The more bureaucratic the organization, the denser the informal networks. Because human beings are basically quite nice. And if the system does bad things, they try and work together to stop the system doing bad things. Yeah? As a result of which, system failure is disguised for longer than it should be. So when actually, it's like an earthquake, when the tension really builds, the break is catastrophic. So the fundamental argument of this is you need to, it's horses for courses, to use that phrase. You use different management techniques in order, in chaos, and complexity. And the problem is all of our management techniques, and particularly our project management techniques, have grown up on the assumption of order or the privileging of order, when the reality is, in a socio-technical environment, we're dealing with complexity. And that requires us, to quote Lincoln, to think anew, to act anew in a different way. But it's clear to get the boundaries first. Some aspects of complexity. Complex systems are highly sensitive to small changes. This is why they're non-causal. Yeah, it's interesting, it's very easy to explain this in a Hindu or a Taoist environment, because those philosophies never got rid of the concept of a non-causal system. Some things just are. Yeah, next time they'll be different. But we removed that from Western philosophy in the 17th century, yeah, to our considerable loss. But basically, what you're dealing with is a system where one small change today may produce no system effect whatsoever, but the same small change tomorrow may generate a massive system change. You can see this if you just want a simple example, look at the press. You know, one day they pick something up, it magnifies. The next day they ignore something worse. In complex adaptive systems, you can't predict in advance what will cause the surge, which is why weak signal detection, fast monitoring is key. Proximity is critical. I mean, anybody got teenage children? Okay, well, the thing you most worry about is when they hit puberty. And the thing you most worry about is who their friends are. Because who they interact with has the most influence over them. And for those of you with teenagers, I'll give you a free gift. This is an interrogation technique. You need it with children. When they come back at 3 o'clock in the morning, you don't know whether to kill them or hug them. And they have some wonderful story involving mobile phone reception and how they really did the sensible thing, and you're pretty sure they're lying through their teeth. Get them to tell the story backwards. It's almost impossible for a human to lie backwards consistently. In fact, in the intelligence service, they spend weeks training people to do this on alibis. I've used it with students on essay excuses, and it's actually very effective. Right? But it's extremely effective with students, but that's a side one. Meaning emerges through interaction. There's a huge density behind this. But fundamentally, one of the things we're starting to talk about now is the concept of meaning has become problematic, just like knowledge was problematic about 20 or 30 years ago. From a complex system, meaning emerges as a result of interactions. It's not pre-given. This doesn't mean we're into relativism, but it means we're into an evolutionary approach. Different things mean different things at different times. And then there's two key phrases. Hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. But the big shift is a shift from fail-safe design approaches to safe-to-fail experimental approaches. The minute you realize the system is complex, you can't design the right solution. What you have to do is to move into small, safe-to-fail experiments, each of which needs to pass a test for coherence. There's a rigor to complexity management, which actually I would argue is more rigorous than order systems management. But you shift from fail-safe to safe-to-fail, which actually radically reduces the cost of intervention. I can talk later, if you want, about some of the work we're doing on urban design. Yeah, because actually that's one of the issues where you need to create a co-evolutionary process between people's needs and engineering capability. To take something from the IT industry where I grew up, there's an adage, users don't know what they want until they get it, and then they want something different. The reason is that they don't know what the technology can do until you give them the technology, and then they start to do things with it you didn't expect. So good design takes a safe-to-fail approach anyway, but now we're starting to get some of the science behind it to amplify that. 3 basic rules or heuristics to managing a complex system. One is distributed cognition. Now this is a phrase of increasing importance. It's sometimes known as wisdom of crowds, but that's a very bad phrase. Crowds are generally herds and stupid. Right? We'll come back to wisdom of crowds in a minute. The proper phrase for it is distributed cognition. What you want is large human sensor networks as part of your cognitive process. This is not the same thing as delegation. And a lot of the ideologues like Senge and Seddon just think it's all about delegating to people. Actually, it isn't. In a complex adaptive system, you may centralize control for good reason. It's what you control that matters. There's nothing wrong with command and control in the right context. It's a great mistake to try and denigrate that. And I'm speaking as a former Welsh Catholic Marxist, all right, so I'm allowed to say this with impunity. Working with the US government, but never mind, that's another story. We need to work with finely grained objects. Small organizational units can be combined and recombined very quickly. Basic law, the law of 5, 15, and 150. Now these are approximate numbers. 5 is Miller's number, the human short-term memory, 7 plus or minus 2. 15 is a natural limit on how many people can simultaneously trust each other. It's actually a learned behavior. It's proportional to the average size of the extended family in the society in which you grew up. Because it's an habituated pattern learned when the brain is very plastic. And 150, which is linked to the neocortex, is a number of identities you can maintain in your mind at any one time. Those are natural limits on work groups. Yet the behavior changes as work groups go through those barriers. It may be plus or minus 2 in each case, but they change. Small groups can be assembled and reassembled in different forms very quickly. Large bureaucratic structures can't actually break apart and be put back together again, except at enormous cost. If you're dealing with a dynamic system, you need small units. The work we do on research, which I'm going to talk about at the end, works with micro-narratives. The narratives at the queue, at the checkout queue, the water cooler, the school gate. Those are the narratives which determine how people will behave, not their responses to questionnaires and surveys. Yet we're dealing with micro-narratives, not grand narratives. So small, granular units are key. Currently doing work to bring the military concept of a crew sideways into industry. In a crew, the crews are never more than about 8 or 9 people, and people are trained in role and role expectation. So a crew can be assembled from people who don't know each other, who've never worked before, but it works. So rather than tiger teams and matrix-based structures, what you do is people come in, they're assessed and trained into role, and the entry into the role is ritualized. That's very important. Yeah? Ritual is key to triggering different human response patterns, which actually allows you to assemble and reassemble across silo crews very quickly. You see the sort of small granularity and the application of some basic science. And then finally, disintermediation. This will make much more sense right at the end. Disintermediation means putting decision makers directly in contact with the raw data. Now, a seminal contract for me some time ago is I worked with the board of Lendlease. Anybody remember Lendlease? An Australian engineering company, built blue water, pioneering guys. The way they managed projects is they had 3 people who went around the world and did project reviews, and nobody ever got out of a project review without being beaten up. But actually, they never told them what to do. They connected them with somebody else. And it was almost like a ritual. The guys have arrived, they're going to take us apart, but then they're going to tell us not what to do, but connect us with other people who may be able to help us. And every now and then, they get in a helicopter and they fly over the site and they work it out for themselves. Because they knew they couldn't rely on multiple reporting levels. That would destroy weak signal detection and opportunity spotting. So disintermediation is putting the primary decision makers in direct contact with raw data. So these are 3 basic heuristics or rules as to how you manage a complex system. You guys want more on this? That's a Harvard article. I'm sort of proud of this. It's an awful article because it has to go through 8 levels of editorship to get in the Harvard Business Review. You do it for marketing purposes, right? If it's a cover article in the Harvard Business Review, however, which it was, then it's respectable. Yeah, and I'm pleased that also won the Academy of Management Award that year, so we were respectable in 2 communities. But that's there, you can see it. So distributed cognition. The 2 classic cases on this are farmers guessing the weight of a cow at a fair. Anybody heard this one? So all the farmers guess the weight of the cow, and the average of the guesses is the weight of the cow. The other classic case is an American submarine grounded. They don't sink. I was corrected on that by an admiral in Norfolk. He pointed out submarines are meant to sink, which is a bit embarrassing, but it's life. When they go down and they won't come up again, they ground. They had a week before they ran out of oxygen. So they got groups of experts, fishermen, ocean current specialists, working completely independently of each other, each to give an estimate of where the position was. then they averaged the position and they were within 6 meters of the submarine. The key principle here, though, which not everybody gets, is that nobody must be aware of the guesses of the other people. Because the minute somebody puts a guess up, everybody else brackets it. Yeah? The other thing is the people who make the decisions have deep, tacit knowledge. Now, just to give you something else from cognitive science, we know it takes the brain 3 to 5 years to physically readjust itself around a new knowledge base. We now know the cognitive science reasons of why apprenticeships are key. You can't acquire knowledge by reading it on a database. Yeah, knowledge is actually also extended into the muscular system, the hormonal system, and interestingly for engineers, scent is more important than you think. Yeah, scent actually works at a subconscious level, and experienced engineers will actually discover a lot of fault finding in that way. Right? And that takes time to acquire and gain. And so we then got some of the science to justify some of the things. Experienced people, well, no profession worth its salt has ever got rid of apprenticeships because they know how critical it is to the way it works. Now, I have a niece at Bristol University who's a medical student, and we almost got expelled because she and her friends hooked themselves up to the dialysis machines every Sunday morning to clear out the alcohol from the day before. And I think the disciplinary tribunal reckoned, okay, they had sinned, but they'd sinned in a way which proved they'd understood medical theory, so they were allowed to continue. But you talk with doctors, they will all tell you that type of story. I've been doing work lately to get the stories from doctors of the first death they caused. And every doctor can tell you the story of the first person they killed. It's almost like a transitionary moment, a point where you start to realize things are serious. Right? It takes time to acquire human knowledge. So you need the tacit knowledge. We're now using this for mass consultation. We're starting to build battlefield systems now where the whole of the army can be engaged in helping the general make a decision without the general having to declare the decision. Yeah, modern technology allows us to use this more extensively. So I want to give you a little test to kind of like prove you can do this. Some of you will have seen this before, in which case you are honor bound not to whisper to your neighbour the answer and prove how clever you are. All right? If anybody does that, I will see them and they will come and stand in the corner of the room for the rest of the class, just to be clear on this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is give you a task. I want you all to carry it through, and the average of the group should be the right answer. So it's a nice little test just to prove it. So I'm going to show you a video which has 6 students in it. 3 have got white t-shirts and 3 have got black t-shirts. And your task, you've seen it before, so don't whisper to anybody. Your task is to count the number of times those with white t-shirts pass the basketball. If you've seen this before, put up your hand and say nothing. Okay, right. For those of you who've seen it before, which is about a quarter of the audience, go through the same process. And you may find the explanation is different from the one you had last time. For the rest of you, got the task? Okay, just to make it difficult, there are 2 balls in play. And I had to show this 8 times to a group of sociologists at Melbourne University before they got the right answer. I do not want to have to stop the video frame by frame and argue with a bunch of anally retentive idiots about what is or is not a pass ever again. So to make it very clear, if the ball leaves the hands of somebody with a white t-shirt and it arrives in somebody else's hands, no matter how it gets there, it's 1 pass. Everybody got that? Okay, start counting now. Okay, shout out the numbers. 14. Okay, 12 or less, put your hands up. 13, 14, 15, 16 or more. That's not bad. The answer's 14. That's a reasonable normal distribution. Aside from people who've seen it before, anything made it difficult or easy to count? No? Anybody see anything unusual? Okay, watch it again, and this time watch the whole movie. Keep watching. Especially around now. That's what we call in the business a weak signal. If that gorilla had just gone mad and had killed half a dozen students and there'd been a commission of inquiry, you'd have all been held accountable. But you don't see the gorilla because you're counting the balls. The one actually people who will see it are economists or computer scientists. If you didn't know it, there's a high degree of partial autism in those departments in universities. Because it's a positive advantage in those fields, yeah? Not to be fully, but to be partially. Like dyslexia is very closely linked with innovation, which if you didn't know it, you need to know it. Because dyslexics make unusual connections just by the nature of the way they are. I'm partially dyslexic. I don't see why everybody, provided all the words are there somewhere, why do you worry about the order? Right? It's just ridiculous, really. And why can't you see that A connects to G? Why do you want me to explain B, C, and D in the process? Yeah? We're now starting to synesthesiacs see the world in a different way. Now, 3 basic facts about the human brain which that video points out. Firstly, you only ever scan about 3 to 5% of what's in front of you. If you're Chinese, it goes up to 10%. It looks like pictorial languages have produced a different evolutionary demand on the brain to non-pictorial languages. We also see a difference between context and object focused. People from pictorial languages will pay more attention to context, and you can see the reason for that. If you don't understand the context of the symbol, you can't get there. The way you then make a decision, so a radiologist in Harvard, let's go back to the original research on this, scans an X-ray, and they scan maybe 3 to 4% of it. That's all they take in. And that's when they're really concentrating. They then have 40 to 50,000 patterns associated with their training and experience as a radiologist on their long-term memory. And the most frequently used patterns are nearer the surface of the brain, so they get activated first. And having scanned 3 to 4% of the X-ray, they do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. And that's how we all make decisions. We satisfy, we don't optimize. And this explains pattern entrainment and all sorts of things. If I had half of you and shown you nature pictures before you saw that, you'd have seen the gorilla. If I'd taken the other half into counting exercises, nobody would have seen it. Because basically I'd have activated different patterns. This is actually quite scary in marketing terms. If I see that lovely little apple symbol, it activates favourable patterns on my brain, so I view everything else through good patterns. On the other hand, if I see 4 coloured rectangles in a wavy pattern, it does the exact opposite. That leads us in marketing to what's called double hit. You send out the first message is to activate the brain to be receptive to the second message. It also means that actually you can't make people rational decision makers. What you've got to do is manage the patterns through which they see the data. That's where human sensor networks come into their own. Now, if you think about this in evolutionary terms, it makes a lot of sense. The early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African belt, and when identified lions, look up best practice case studies on how to deal with lions? By that time, the document you'll really need is the manual on the digestive tract of a large carnivore, because that's where you'll be located. We evolved to make decisions very quickly based on partial data scans, and to adopt a very old joke about 2 Canadians meeting a bear in the forest, run faster than our companion. We are pattern recognition intelligences, not information processing machines. But what do we do in organizations? We try and force people to be information processors, which dumbs down their intelligence. There's a very old joke on this. You will find people at BT, there's one guy at BT Martlesham who's a total and utter idiot, who keeps predicting that computers will exceed human beings in intelligence within a defined time period. It gets him good publicity. He's assuming that human brains work on binary processes, which they don't. Amplitude and gases are part of it. But he may be right, because we're probably planning to meet computers halfway. If we continue to drive people into rigid, process-based information-process decision-making, human beings are as capable of losing intelligence over 2 or 3 generations as they are of gaining it. And I would express an extreme concern at the point at this moment. We are developing at the moment a generation of specialists. We're losing generalists. And a collection of specialists is not the same thing as a generalist. When I was at school, and this is back in the 60s, I did physics, pure maths, applied maths, geology, and history as A-levels. And it was unusual to do a history with a science combination. But even with that, if we hadn't read Shakespeare, we were considered inadequate human beings. Yeah? Now, it's difficult to get my son, who is studying chemistry, to even read a book outside the context of his own discipline. My daughter, who's doing anthropology, gets given a pre-read reading pack at the start of every term, rather than having to go and explore and find things serendipitously in the library. And everybody is focused on module by module achievement rather than education. Now, I say this as a general concern. Particularly those of you who deal with systems involving engineering with people, the ability to understand both becomes key. In fact, I think MBA programs should be abolished because they're based on cases and they confuse correlation with causation. I'm currently putting one together for one of the universities I'm associated with that we may or may not get through, in which the MBA is nothing but 2 years of first-year courses in anthropology, psychology, biology, and the final year is a thesis to apply the knowledge they've gained. Because that gives them a knowledge base to be good managers. Whereas teaching them how some American companies say they were successful actually produces exactly the wrong effect. So, moving on from that, this is the Cynefin framework. This kind of like takes the complexity theory on a bit. Cynefin is a Welsh word. Anybody speak Welsh? Okay. Its literal translation into English is habitat or place. But it don't mean that. The best translation I've seen is in Sinclair Lewis. Basically, it says it's the place of your multiple belongings. It implies a routine in many different, both physical space, spiritual space, family space, tribal space. It's this sense of being a nexus of a flow in time. So it's a very good name for a complexity model. The reason the English don't have an equivalent for it, by the way, is that you've never had a place of your own, you've only ever stolen other people's. And we haven't forgiven you for the 13th century yet, but that's an old rivalry. So the Cynefin framework takes those 3 domains, but it takes order and it divides it into 2. Simple order is where the relationship between cause and effect is self-evident to everybody. Yeah? As a result of which we can apply best practice, and this is the only legitimate domain of that. And our decision model is sense, categorize, respond. We then have complicated order. Sorry, I've gone too far on that. In complicated order, there is a relationship between cause and effect. It does repeat because of the system constraints, but it can only be known through analysis or expertise. So it's not self-evident, so people have to believe in the analysis or believe in the experts to gain the solution. And here we apply good practice. A major mistake people make is to try and force people in a complicated domain to choose one solution, when actually the real experts know there's 3 or 4 different roads, and they can't quite explain how because they'll know it when they need to know it. A huge amount of human knowledge is only known when we're contextually stimulated to know it. It's not known in abstract, which is why interviewing people about what they know is one of the most singly stupid things consultants do. And it's a fairly low bar to define stupid things that consultants do, but that's one of the worst. On the other hand, a complex system, remember the Children's Party? We probe sense response. We can only know a complex system by interacting with it, which actually means we can't model it. And this is one of the key distinctions between complexity thinking and systems dynamics. Systems dynamics is obsessed with models. To quote Murray Gell-Mann, the only valid model of a human system is the system itself. In complex systems, we have frameworks through which we can perceive the system. We don't have models because that has too much baggage with it. Yeah, models work in order, they don't work in complexity. And the trouble is everybody's got obsessed with agent-based models, which are fine for understanding ants and bird flocking behavior, but human beings have intentionality and multiple identities. So you actually haven't got discrete agency, so the models break down automatically. And we make decisions based on contextual rules anyway. And of course we have a chaotic space in which we get novel practice, in complex is always emergent, where we act sense respond. And that middle bit, I haven't got time to go into it, is called disorder, which is a state of not knowing which of the domains you're in. Which actually means you make decisions based on what you normally do. Bureaucrats always interpret problems of a failure of order, because actually that's where they're comfortable. Now what we're trying to do here is to create boundaries. Human beings don't understand gradients. If you give human beings a gradient, even with two extreme labels, they'll define the system to fit where they're comfortable. If you put a boundary in the system, they will behave differently on each side. Boundaries are very important to changing human behavior. Okay? And one of the ways the Cynefin framework is used is to define the space. That's the catastrophic fold, by the way, I talked about earlier, in which if you overstructure things, it breaks catastrophically. Yeah, but there's more in the paper elsewhere. We use this in project management. A large part of the project can be put here, a large part can be put there, but the 5% of the project which is going to cause the 95% of the grief is over there. And that's where you use radically different techniques. Techniques such as social network stimulation. What social network stimulation does is it builds networks across silos with people who've never worked together before to solve problems. Now, it's a very simple technique to practice. You can look it up on our website. It's open source. But what it does is it builds network capability in order that the network can find solutions. You have to distribute the solution finding into the network, but you do it in a controlled way. Crews are another example of solving problems in a complex space. In IT terms, what we actually do is we get most of the project out of the way here, the stuff which nobody knows what the hell to do. We have a competition in which small people can form teams and write programs in their own time. And the ones the users want get put into the project, and the prize is they get to write that bit of the project. That's a prize to die for in an IT community. But it allows this co-evolutionary process between technology capabilities and user requirements. But we also use it generally for strategy. This is an S-curve. Everybody come across S-curves? Again, it's basically a theory of how things come in. So what I've done here is I've combined it with Moore's Crossing the Chasm. Anybody read that? Okay, Moore's Crossing the Chasm is probably the best book on IT marketing I know, so I strongly recommend it. So I've combined the two. Basically, the idea is when a new idea comes into play, the early adopters get very, very excited. And nobody minds this because all companies want to have a space where people have novel ideas. It's kind of like considered good form. Yeah, they're always put behind barriers somewhere safe and not allowed to talk with anybody. We used to have a phrase in IBM, oh, it's performing seal time again, is it? Because what would happen is, they sell an outsourcing contract, they put in the cost reduction guys, and they'd want somebody from research to come and excite the clients. But they excite the client about your latest idea, but then they'd send you back to research because you were disturbing the environment, yeah? We used to say that was performing seal time. Came around every year on the annual appraisals. What then happens is the idea becomes serious, and at that point, the white blood cells kick in. This is the Cardinal Beddomini moment, and it's not deliberate. It's taken me years to realize this, but as I keep trying to tell my children, wisdom comes with age. But for some reason, they don't understand that. I can't really realize. But basically, people aren't killing you because they don't like you. It's just an allergic reaction of the system to something too different. And of course, some ideas survive that, and they become the new orthodoxy. Often compromised in the process. That's what actually happened with systems dynamics. It got fatally compromised by its early adopters. And then basically it gets taken to excess, it loses utility, but actually that's where the next new idea comes in. And now you see the reason for the overlap? It's only when the new idea is finally coming to the end of its lifespan, there's space for a new idea. But of course it dominates, so it suppresses it some more. And the key thing to understand is if you don't change then, you don't survive. The British IT industry went under in the 80s because it didn't understand that the world had changed. And I could go through hundreds of other examples. And that allows me to look at the pattern of management science over the years. We have scientific management from the turn of the last century to the 1980s, sometimes known as Taylorism. Big new idea, management is a science. Big new technology, the telephone. It's actually quite interesting. If you look at the history of human change, it's communication technologies which trigger the biggest change. Because, of course, they connect people in different ways. The Renaissance wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't been for stealing how to create cheap paper from the Chinese. It wasn't the printing press, it was cheap paper. And that allowed us to communicate through the printed word. The telephone transformed industry from you owned a ship, you owned a factory, to you owned an international business. Yeah, and then we get Taylor and everything which comes with that. These guys took a military model because it was the only model available about how to manage large groups of people. The trouble is they took the peacetime military model, they didn't take the wartime military model. I do a lot of work in military environments. In wartime, everything changes. The hierarchy is dissolved. But of course that wasn't done. But don't knock it, it worked very well until the 1980s. Oh, and incidentally, the other thing, 1920s, recession. You should start to see a pattern there. New idea, new communication technology, recession. It's like a perfect storm. When they come together, it allows something to happen. 1980s, we get systems dynamics. Yeah, systems thinking starts to come through here with Forrester, Stafford Beer, and other people. It gets popularized by people like Senge. But fundamentally, what it focuses on is outcome. The principle here is you define a future state. This is where we get 3-year plans and 5-year plans for Porter, Hammer and Chanfrey, re-engineering the corporation, Kaplan and Norton, the balanced scorecard. The assumption is the organization is a machine which can be engineered. That's the big idea which comes in on the 80s. One of the big problems with the 1980s to the current day is people have tried to replace humans with information technology. Yeah, and that's kind of like the fetishistic period, we're moving out of that. And the big new idea is complexity. Now, a couple of big differences. What you see with the systems dynamics guys is they want to define outcomes. Senge wants to define common values. The way you manage a system is you define what values people have. In fact, Fifth Discipline is a very scary book, because it says everybody should assume their individual attitudes in the greater good of the corporation. And of course, what the greater good of the corporation is determined by the executives. Yeah, fortunately, it never happened, because it would destroy genetic variety. You need people who think differently, because it creates the variety. Big difference between efficiency and effectiveness. A system which hasn't got a degree of inefficiency in it will never be effective, because it loses adaptive capacity. We've over-focused on efficiency at the expense of effectiveness. Yeah, so big differences on that. A couple more things to finish off on. I just want to create, and I'll go through this quite quickly because I'm coming to the end of the period. You all familiar with this little beastie? Everybody assesses risk based on these. Yeah, so the idea is that if something is here, it's so improbable you don't have to take account of it. Sound familiar? Okay, that's all very well when you're tossing coins. There's another thing called the Pareto distribution. This is earthquakes, otherwise known as a power law. If I do a double log scale of size against frequency of any natural phenomenon, I get one of these beasties. And if I draw that on this, the curve looks like that. It has a fat tail. So something that I can dispense with is so improbable I don't have to worry about it. Turns out to actually have quite a high probability if I use a Pareto distribution rather than a Gaussian one. And guess what? Gaussian distributions don't appear in nature. Pareto distributions do. This is called the New Orleans-Levy's problem. Because people assess the risk based on a Gaussian distribution, actually it's Pareto. Now, one of the big consequences of this is a shift from strategies based on robustness to strategies based on resilience. If the world is such that you can't avoid failure, what matters is early detection, fast recovery. And strategically, that's even more important because it allows you to spot opportunities faster. If you architect on the assumption of tolerable failure, you will be in a much better place. My favourite example is if you go up the river to Gloucester, people built houses a few years ago on glebes and water meadows. It sounded terribly romantic in the estate agents' literature. And then over the last few years, they've discovered why they're called water meadows. And when the government withdrew the insurance levy, they're about to become uninsurable. Now, if you look at the way houses were built in the 18th century, they have stone fag floors, no plaster, and hooks in the beams. Because they know you don't want a damper-proof course, because what matters is water draining away quickly. The hooks in the beams are so you put ropes around your furniture and hook them on the beams. So the water goes through, you're okay again almost straight away. People are now rebuilding in the floodplains on the same principle. Good soil science, no plaster on the walls, electric cables which go up to the top and come down, and hooks with electronic pulleys, because we don't know our neighbours well enough these days to hike your furniture up. And increasing the door sill size. And what you're doing is you're doing your best to prevent failure, but you're assuming every now and then there will be a failure. So you're architecting on the basis of tolerated failure. Now, every civil engineer I've ever known, I've worked with a lot, has always done that anyway. And the trouble is, the sponsors want them to define systems which will never fail. And that's dangerous. So this concept of building strategies based on resilience rather than robustness is one of the really big things coming through at the moment. And again, that fits in with the safe fail. And that sort of explains it in more detail. So what you basically got at the top, in Gaussian, what you've got is many to many. You've got many outcomes, many inputs, so stats works. The trouble is, when you get into low frequency, high impact events, you've got lots of input, a small number of outcomes, like terrorism. So you haven't got a normal statistical prediction route. So whereas we use deductive logic or induction, deduction is if A then B. Induction is I've got lots of A's, all of which have B's in them. Therefore A is associated with B. Big danger on induction is confusing correlation with causation, something which is endemic in management science. The fact that 50 successful companies have managing directors who play golf doesn't mean if your managing director plays golf, you will be successful. But every article in the Harvard Business Review, with the exception of one in November 2007, actually makes that assumption. A lot of the complexity guys, instead, are confusing simulation with prediction. The fact your model can simulate historical reality doesn't mean it can predict the future. But you can simulate birds flying around in the sky, but whether they go to the left or right of the mountain, you can't predict, as major consequences. What we do down here is called abduction. Abduction is making connections between things which are apparently unconnected. It's about plausible routes, not probable routes. And of course, this is what human beings do naturally. We're very geared up towards serendipity. The trouble is, it suffers from a logical error. For those of you who haven't done logic, post hoc ergo sumpter prop. The fact that I can make this association and you can make a contradictory association, how do we prove which is which? The way you handle that is by huge volumes of human agents making a decision. Because that way I can create objectivity in an abductive form, which is key to innovation and weak signal detection. And just to show you an example of that, ignore that one. This is called the fitness landscape, and this is my final slide. That has got 17,000 micro-narratives in it. We did this project in Iran. We sponsored a university who sponsored a university, so this project was entirely done by Iranian citizens asking stories about culture in Iran with no mention of the West. The stories were told by people and self-interpreted by the people who told the story. I'll put a link on the website tonight to something which explains that in more detail. But the principle of this is I don't want an expert to tell me what people's stories mean. I want the person who told the story to tell you what it means, but within a framework that I can interpret. Okay? So that model has 17,000 micro-narratives quantitatively interpreted at the point of origin, not qualitatively. So I've got numbers. And the hollows represent belief systems which aren't going to change because they're stable attractor mechanisms. The peaks represent areas where change can happen quickly. Weak signal detection. The depressing thing about that is, however we look at this, we get those two big hollows. One is anti-American, the other is anti-West. We've allowed a nation to define itself by not being us, and we've got to take responsibility for that. Yeah, they're not responsible, we're responsible for that in basic anthropology terms. So if you want to change something, you don't go anywhere near that, because everybody believes something and they'll listen to 2% of what you say, and they'll listen to the 2% which responds to the negative belief. What you want to do is to find an area here and make it deeper. We're now doing this for architects. Sorry to mention architects, I did promise to only do it once. Yeah? Where we're getting stories from people in a city area about what sort of space they want to live in. We're not asking them about the redevelopment. We're asking them to tell stories about lives that they would want. Very abstract questions. Index into a structure. Then we're getting architectural students to index buildings into the same structure. And then we're mashing the two databases together. Which is actually what a really experienced architect does after 40 or 50 years of life. And start to think about that. You put knowledge bases into customer bases, you move them together, you draw these sort of things. But critically, we kept the model fixed and moved it on 3 months. So the yellow dots represent outliers, things which don't fit. And 3 months on, there are now 28,000 micro-narratives in that picture. Cost of this project was $25,000, by the way. Compare that with traditional market research. And you see that little cluster of 8 stories, bottom right? That's a fear of being seen as barbaric and uncivilized. That's a weak signal. And the point, this is disintermediation. Your eye is drawn to the outliers, not to the dominant patterns. We got this, we've got a US firm, every 250 stores across the States, every 100th customer gets given a drink or a chocolate bar for free if they'll go into a video booth and tell a story about their experience. The marketing director has this on their desk, and they can click on the model and listen to the stories told by their consumers. No market researchers, no mystery shoppers, no interpretive frameworks, but direct access. We did one for the UK government recently, 3,000 micro-narratives in Pakistan in 2 days, including 1,000 from the refugee camps, 9,000 from the UK from inner city areas, interpretation out 24 hours after capture, using children as field ethnographers in a schools program. I wanted to show you that at the end because I wanted to come up with something you can do. It's very easy to criticize, but it's more difficult to come up with. The world we're now moving into is one in which it is informed by natural science. It's as radical a change in natural science now as 300 or 400 years ago. In fact, what's interesting is the merge between two. The merge between biology and anthropology is fascinating at the moment. We've got huge opportunities to think about the world in a different way. But we can't afford to do that with the idealistic cant of systems dynamics, and I'm being deliberately rude there, but actually it's true. It's all about employ me and we'll do it right. Actually, that doesn't work. You've got to change the system. Okay? Natural science gives us scalability and a degree of certainty to move forward, but we need to understand how social systems can be augmented and evolve with technology and engineering practice. They're not separate, they're co-evolutionary. Thank you very much for your time.